Welcome back, Doctor.
Good morning, Your Honor.
You can come on down to the witness stand. I'm not sure if we have something else to discuss, but at least that witness chair is probably more comfortable than that hard bench, so you might as well get yourself situated and comfortable.
Thank you.
Again, sorry for having to bring you back. Thank you for being here
I
today.
understand.
Judge, I think we have to address the state's issue at the end of yesterday because we are in the expert
The gun.
testimony. Yes. Judge, I can tell the court I looked for the specific issue in relation to, an insanity case or a statement made to a state doctor. Didn't find anything. However, I put some cases on the bench that I believe are analogous to what the court must do. And these deal with when a defendant, let's say, wants to testify and his statement or confession's been suppressed, and the state wants to use that statement for impeachment. There's certain things
You
that
can
the court...
use it for impeachment.
Not always. You have to make a finding that it's voluntary. And so I cite to Nolan, which is 346 Southern 2nd 1020. You go to page 3 of the opinion in the right-hand column. Basically, in this case, the statement was suppressed for violation of Miranda. The defendant basically got on the stand and lied or committed perjury. And the court went on to say that you can't just circumvent Miranda, and obviously a defendant can't use the fact that the statement was suppressed to get on the stand and commit perjury. But in that right-hand column, footnote 1024, the very least the court means that the statements must be voluntarily given. When the state, in order to impeach a defendant's credibility, chooses to present evidence of a defendant's incriminating statements which are inconsistent with trial testimony of the defendant and which are inadmissible in the case in chief, which is what we have here, because of a failure in that case to give Miranda, the statements must be shown to be voluntarily made before they may be admitted. I also cite to Willisey, which is 640 Southern 2nd 1079. That's a Supreme Court of Florida's case. If you look at footnote 5, the first page of that opinion, defendants' inculpatory statements can be admitted for impeachment purposes, but the state must, by a preponderance of the evidence, show that the statement was voluntarily made.
But in all those cases, that's the statement that was made to police that was suppressed. Is there anything, and I guess the best analogy that I came up with is here. Had she confessed to the police at the Florida State Police Department, whether it was a violation of, whether they didn't read Miranda, or whether they read Miranda, or whether she invoked and they still asked her what happened, and the legal conclusion, well, that's what happened with the gun. I'm throwing in something different because it's part of my analogy. Had she confessed, not talked about the gun, but had she talked about shooting her mother and Bob, and that was clearly suppressed because they violated her Miranda rights, what about the fact that she said it to her brother on the phone? Wouldn't that still come in? The statement to somebody else?
She didn't tell her brother about the gun in this scenario. I would agree with you.
My analogy, though.
But if it's the same statement and it's coming in a different way, sure, that's not what we have here. If she had told the cops about the gun in violation of Miranda and that gets suppressed, then she tells the brother in a separate conversation about the gun, I'd submit to the court that the statement to the brother is admissible. That's not what we have here. The only mention of a gun is to police after she asks for a lawyer. And the case law is clear.
I don't intend to let that in. I don't think that's what they're asking. I absolutely don't intend to allow her statement to the police about the gun in.
Correct. But what you're now going to allow is a doctor to testify that when she's talking about the events and asking her questions, my client during that evaluation isn't thinking that's been suppressed. Am I supposed to say yes? Am I supposed to say no? She tells Dr. Lazaro the whole scenario about the homicides. While all that's relevant to insanity, what she does with the gun after is not, and it's been suppressed. And so now the jury hears this statement that's been suppressed during a compulsory examination by a state expert that she must abide by and follow, because that wasn't her choice to make those statements to Dr. Lazaro. I certainly haven't elicited them through my defense experts, and so it's a compulsory, court-ordered examination by a state expert where she can't say, no, I'm not going to answer that, or no, I'm not going to cooperate with the evaluation. It's the same thing. And the case law is clear that a finding of when a statement is suppressed and the state cannot introduce it in its case in chief, I'm analogizing it to these cases, a finding of voluntariness must be made.
You have my attention with the fact that it's a compulsory exam. But I want to go back to my analogy a minute because I'm still a little confused. It might be because I haven't had my coffee yet. If she had said to her brother, that she threw the gun in the lake, would it be your position that it's not admissible because that same statement to police was suppressed?
No. But that's not what we have here. So the jury has not heard anything about the gun until Dr. Lazaro, during a compulsory, court-ordered state examination, gets to say it.
Yeah.
And it's not voluntary. My other concern, Judge, is we are now approaching basically trampling Nicole Nachtman's constitutional rights. This jury has now heard she invoked. That's completely impermissible, and I objected. They now heard she asked for a lawyer, and it was because we wanted the totality of...
I can't let that go without... It was at the defense suggestion that even came up to let the jury hear.
Under the position that we were not going to be able to get any of the statement
When
in.
it was
so now
suggested, I hadn't ruled on it.
All I'm saying is the Constitution is in place for a reason. They've now heard she invoked, which is never admissible. In this circumstance, I understand the court's ruling, the totality of the circumstances. If I want the statement in, they get to hear all of it. Now we're going to allow a statement that was suppressed, that Detective Messer himself told Nicole Nachtman and has testified previously that that statement was inadmissible, and I know it, and therefore I asked her because I wanted to know where the gun was for safety. Clearly, I didn't get to ask Detective Messer about that. Did you tell her it was inadmissible? Did you tell her that anything about the gun? None of that's been elicited. So now Dr. Lazaro gets to testify about a court-ordered compulsory examination that my client had to cooperate with and answer questions about. It's a violation of what I believe the case law stands for in regards to when a statement is suppressed, a finding of voluntariness.
You've said enough that I'm uncomfortable and I'm concerned. That's my position. Mr. Terry, I mean...
We are not...
It's got a lot of legal baggage with it. Is it really worth the risk?
Judge, absolutely. First of all, the statement to... It is a specific statement to the specific detective who violated Miranda. The purpose of suppression, the main purpose of suppression, if you go back all the way through case law, is to punish police conduct that's inappropriate, correct? Mm-hmm. So it's to punish the police... So yes, Detective Messer, the statement to Detective Messer, out. But now they have placed an affirmative defense. Okay, they're the ones who brought this defense forward. They're the ones who are claiming she was insane. They're the ones, by claiming insanity, they basically waive those rights and allow us to have a doctor examine her by law. So it's not compulsory, it's by law. We have the right to have a doctor examine. They're the ones who are bringing it forward. They are voluntarily bringing this defense forward. She told not only my doctor, but the other doctors as well as what she did with the gun. That goes to her insanity. The fact that she got rid of that gun, got rid of evidence, goes to show consciousness of guilt. It's a very strong piece of evidence as far as the insanity goes. And
don't they concede that prong, though, when we look at, that she knew that what she did was wrong?
Yes, sir, that's not the prong we're...
Didn't Dr. Heidi concede that?
Well, from Dr. Ewing, he does not concede that.
I do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, his deposition, he did not.
So
his
if they
deposition, he said,
concede that, again,
it.
I ask you the question, is it worth the risk? It has so much legal baggage to it. The only thing it supports is a prong of a test that they concede that they're not contesting. Do you really want me to let that in? Do you really, really
Judge,
want
I'm
me to
not
let
scared
that
of it. I am not scared of it because I believe the law is completely on the side of this.
And in the past... I wish the Attorney General was sitting at the table with you, because then down the road I get these appeals from stuff and they concede it. Things that were argued to me by an assistant state attorney that they're not scared of, and then it goes up on appeal and the Attorney General concedes it.
Judge, what about every other statement she made to
No offense to the Attorney General.
Judge, I'm just going to ask you, what about every other statement that was made to Dr. Lazaro? These are all post-Miranda statements. Everything was made to Dr. Lazaro was post-Miranda. Everything that was made to the other doctors was post-Miranda, and it was voluntary. She gave it up. She explained what her mindset was. All of that evidence would not be admissible. It would be violation of Miranda, and it would immediately come back on appeal. So all of those statements are separate and apart now because they have waived all of that by putting forth this defense.
I don't necessarily disagree with you, but in this, this particular statement to the police was suppressed. And in combination with that, she was promised by the police that this statement about where the gun is, because of the safety to the public, could not be used against her. So on appeal, they're going to be arguing that that's still in her mind. She was promised by the police that because the safety of that issue regarding the gun could not be used against her when she said it. So that carries over. She's saying it to everybody because the police promised her that it couldn't be used against her.
Judge, let's say this happens. Let's say she said, tells the police what she did with the gun. Then she's in jail later, and she talks to one of the inmates and says, you know what I did? I got rid of the gun. And she says it voluntarily to that jailhouse inmate.
It comes in.
It comes in.
It comes in if she told her brother. They admit that. It comes in if she told her brother.
And that's exactly what we're dealing with here. She had voluntarily said to this doctor, I threw the gun in the lake. That's a voluntary statement to another witness.
As part of a compulsory medical exam. The word compulsory
No, it wasn't
is
compulsory.
in there.
Judge, it's not compulsory for Dr. Ewing. They're the ones who hired Dr. Ewing to come in and ask her these questions.
I have purposely not elicited anything pertaining to the gun, neither in Dr. Heidi's testimony, nor did I plan to in Dr. Ewing's, because of the court's ruling on the suppression. So those statements are not being elicited by my doctors at all.
Judge, that's fine for her to not elicit him, but I can because she said it to him voluntarily. I didn't compel Dr. Ewing to go there and talk to her and find out what she had to say. They're the ones who are presenting this defense. They're the ones who have the burden of proof on it. They're the ones who are providing these witnesses. I should be able to cross-examine these witnesses about anything that goes to her state of mind. Anything she voluntarily said to them about her state of mind. And the gun goes directly to her state of mind at that time.
Regardless of how I feel, whether I think that it's a risk, I said I'm concerned. I said it has a lot of legal baggage with it. I shouldn't have to explain that. I think that, but at the end of the day, I don't see any legal reason to suppress it at this time. The appellate courts may disagree with me down the road. I think it's a risk. I caution the state. I'm ruling that it can come in, but I caution you to think about it, to think about whether you really want to do it, whether you need it. Because I'm concerned. But concern is not enough for me to rule. I don't rule with, the way that I feel about something. I rule about what I believe the law to be. But I think that there are certainly some appellate issues that are going to follow this if there's a conviction in this case. There's no question about that.
Understood.
All right. I'm letting it in under the same reasoning that if it had been made to the brother, it would come in. I understand that you distinguished that it wasn't made to the brother. You acknowledge that it would come in if it was made to the brother, and your position is that it came in a compulsory medical exam. However, it apparently comes in statements to your experts as well. So that's why I'm letting it in.
Judge, I'm just going to add at this point that, and you said it at the sidebar, that you look at outside the scope of direct broadly, but I'm going to lodge that objection on behalf of our client at this time because we've intentionally not enlisted that type of information. Mr. Terry told you yesterday he was doing it through Dr. Lazaro because he sees what you're getting ready to do. He now switches to Dr. Ewing, and the record should be clear that that's what's going on here because it's outside the scope of direct. Period.
Direct's not over, though.
She's not going to elicit it. She's an officer of the court, and she's made that representation to you. Now, do we have to strategize now and figure out if we want to bring it up? I'll tell you my recommendation to Ms. Hersey's going to say absolutely not, because at some point it's going to become clear in this record that because of the things and the tactics and the convincing that the state has done, we're getting put into these positions where we have a lot of things that we're not going to be put in a position that we've waived our appellate. In other words, we're not going to be in a position where we're waiving.
I certainly understand. You need to perfect the record and preserve these things for appeal. Number one, the direct is not over, and you have the advantage now of knowing what my ruling on that legal issue that came up. I wish it had come up earlier. But as far as scope, this doctor's talking about her insanity, the prongs of insanity, and things that she did or reported to him that relate to those, I don't believe are beyond the scope. I do, again, want to add to my caution to the state that the only thing that it appears that this evidence would support is a prong that they concede. So that's just something to consider. And that's not a reason for me to rule that it doesn't come in, but it's something I think that the state should weigh in determining whether they want to elicit evidence that has baggage, legal baggage with it, and appellate issues that only support a prong that the defense and the experts concede. I don't know why you would want to do that, but if you want to do it, I'm giving you the green light to do it.
I also want to point out, Judge, that you instructed both parties to do research, which I did, and the state has cited no case law that this is permissible.
I understand.
But I
I
will ask for permission to speak to Mr. Ewing on this very limited issue. So
I-
we have not prepared for that because I was not planning on eliciting it.
You may. I did my own research, and I listened to the argument, and I made the ruling that I think is the correct.
Have a moment to maybe go out?
You want to step outside?
Yes,
You may.
thank you. You want to come out?
Approximately how long do you think you need?
Judge, no more than 10 minutes.
All right, we'll take a 10-minute break.
Judge, while Ms. Hirsch is coming in, so the court's the reason it was a concern for me is because...
Wait for Ms. Hershey.
Well, Ms. Holt's here. I just want to express to the court what we've talked about and what I believe we've potentially agreed on.
Oh.
At the deposition, because today, while we were sitting here having this argument, Dr. Ewing said, I do believe she knew it was wrong. But at the deposition, he said, I'm not sure she did, but I'm also not sure she didn't. That's what I was concerned about with the wrongfulness portion. He never made a full opinion. I asked him and told him, if he's willing to state today that yes, at the time she knew it was wrong, I will not bring it, and I will agree to keep out the whole gun situation.
All right, I appreciate it, because I planned on asking you, isn't that the easier thing, just to ask him if he agrees to that prong?
I absolutely, Judge, but during the deposition that I took of him, he would not agree conclusively to the wrong.
Okay.
He said, I can't say she knew it was wrong, I can't say she didn't. I just, if he's willing to say today, if his opinion is now...
Then you're not going to go into anything
then I won't go
on the
into
gun.
it. Then I won't go into it.
All right, well, that's up to you all, and you know how I've ruled, so it's up to you. Is the state ready?
Yes, oh, one other issue, Judge. Well, I guess we can wait till after we get started.
Yeah, let's get started. Let's get the jury out here, because they probably wonder why I asked them to be here at 8:45 every morning if we don't get started till 10.
I get it.
Is the defense ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's bring in the jury. Again, thank you, doctor. Thank you for your patience.
No problem, Your Honor.
You're going to ask him, though, on direct, so they'll have the benefit of knowing before the cross?
Judge, I'm going to ask him about his opinion as to prong B. I'm not eliciting any statements about the gun because it's my position they're not admissible.
No, I understand that.
I'm going to ask him about his opinion as to the insanity altogether.
Okay. Jury is present, seated. Everyone else may be seated at this time. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good morning. Welcome back. My first question is, did anybody have any exposure to the case outside of the courtroom, discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else, or do any research related to the case by show of hands? Let the record reflect there are no hands. Again, thank you all very much. Again, welcome back. We are going to pick up where we left off. Oh, and additionally, I apologize for the late start. I take full responsibility for all delays in getting started on time. Is the defense ready?
Yes, sir.
All right. The witness is still on the stand from yesterday, or back on the stand from yesterday, and still under oath.
Good morning, Dr. Ewing.
Good morning.
I think yesterday when we broke, were discussing evidence of psychological abuse that Nicole had experienced at the hands of her mother. Is that your recollection about where we left off?
Yes.
Okay. And you had testified to various instances, both in the records, family reports, and Nicole herself as to that abuse.
Yes.
And I think one of the last things we discussed yesterday was the video evaluations by the state doctor, Dr. Lazaro. Did you have an opportunity to view those?
Yes.
Okay. And with regard to Nicole's recitation of these instances of both physical and emotional abuse, psychological abuse, as she's telling the state doctor, what were your observations about her demeanor, her reaction in those videos, which occurred not even a month or two ago?
She was sobbing. She was hysterical. She couldn't control her emotions.
And when I say a few months ago, we're talking about that was still her reaction in 2019.
Yes.
And were some of the instances that she's describing to Dr. Lazaro things from her childhood as well as up and through college?
Yes.
What does that tell you that still in 2019, from a psychologist's perspective, that Nicole's reaction is so dramatic and sobbing and just uncontrollable crying? What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me a couple of things. One is that the trauma was great. The trauma was severe. The trauma that accrued to her as a result of the psychological and physical abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother. Beyond that, it tells me that she remains severely mentally ill, which, to be honest, would be expected. Her mental health has deteriorated in recent years up to the time of the homicide and has continued to deteriorate. She's able to function because she's in a very controlled environment in jail where her every need is met and where, as Dr. Lazaro pointed out to her in her examination, there's no stress for her.
And I want to get to that now. What evidence did you see before we get to her time that she's been in jail where whether Ms. Nachtman was capable of normal adult life activities? What evidence in both the records and from Ms. Nachtman did you see in that regard?
She was not able to function as a 21-year-old person should, functioning more like a preteen, maybe an early teenager at best. She wasn't washing her clothes. She was sleeping on a bare mattress. She was found sleeping in the hallway. She was found sleeping in the bathroom of her dormitory. She had a body odor that was discernible to just about anybody who came into contact with her. She didn't comb her hair. She didn't brush her teeth. She wore the same clothes day in and day out. She wore, even during the warm part of the year, the warmest part of the year, I should say, she would wear multiple layers of clothing that were just inappropriate to the weather. Those are some of the things that I observed.
What are those typically signs or symptoms of her inability at that point to care for herself at the time she's in college, 21 years old?
Well, first of all, it's a sign that she's extremely immature, but clinically those behaviors are consistent with schizophrenia, which is the diagnosis that I placed on her.
Now, before we get to your actual diagnosis, and we're going to go through the criteria in a minute, tell me what you meant when you said now she's been in jail and what how jail is different than when she was 4 years ago in college navigating life by herself.
From what I've been able to see, she feels okay about jail. She no longer feels threatened or fearful. Jail is really, sadly, a good place for her to be right now. She doesn't have to make any decisions for herself. Everything is decided, and she can be herself. She no longer fears threats from her mother.
You mentioned that jail is kind of, they tell you when to wake up, they tell you to eat, and so she's not having to make those decisions or do that on her own.
Yeah, she really doesn't have to make any decisions on her own.
Tell the jury briefly what the DSM-5 is.
It's
I'm sorry, before I go there.
okay.
Wasn't reading my notes. Tell me whether you have an opinion as to whether, based on the psychological abuse, the physical abuse at the hands of her mother, whether you have an opinion as to whether Nicole meets battered child syndrome. And I guess it would be appropriate at this point to kind of explain what battered child syndrome is to the jury.
I do have an opinion, and it is that she does suffer from battered child syndrome. Battered child syndrome is a term that originated from a pediatric radiologist named Henry Kemp, Dr. Kemp, and he was looking at x-rays of children who were abused, and what he was able to discover is that a lot of child abuse, physical child abuse, went undetected. Things like spiral fractures, things that could be seen with an x-ray. At that time, the modern scanning devices weren't available, but he coined the term battered child syndrome. And as it's evolved in the literature over the years, in the professional literature in psychology and psychiatry, it's come to encompass physical abuse, psychological abuse, and or sexual abuse. So basically what it is, it's a finding that this youngster was severely abused, either physically, psychologically, and or sexually, and that as a result of that abuse, she developed the typical psychological responses that we see. And typically what we see is somebody who goes through that kind of experience as a child develops significant personality issues. And that's what we've seen here with Nicole Nachtman. She never fully developed as a person. Her personality development was stunted, and she suffers from a major mental illness, schizophrenia.
All right, go ahead and explain to the jury what the DSM-5 is.
This is it, this book. It's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the 5th edition. It's published by the American Psychiatric Association. It is 9 because it lays out all the required symptoms for all the recognized mental illnesses in our field. So if it's not in this book, then most people, I'm not saying all people, but most people in the field would not make a diagnosis except on the basis of the criteria that are posted in this book, the DSM-5.
When you say people in the field, both psychologists and psychiatrists.
And any other mental health professionals.
I'm, for the record, have as a demonstrative aid, page 99 of the DSM-5, the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. Walk us through why you diagnosed Nicole Nachtman with schizophrenia, and let's go one by one.
Well, first it says to make this diagnosis, we have to have 2 or more of the following, each present for a significant portion of time during a 1-month period or less if successfully treated. There's been no treatment in this case, so that doesn't apply. At least one of these must be 1, 2, or 3. So the first criterion that needs to be met is delusions. Nicole meets that criterion. She explained to me that she was convinced that her mother would kill her. This was at the time leading up to the homicides, which I don't believe is fact. A delusion is a fixed belief that someone has that can't be shaken by the truth. And almost always the fixed belief is false. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a delusion. But her delusional thinking goes beyond that. She was convinced that Bob, Mr. Deans, had killed her dog. She was convinced that he had put dog feces in her room and then blamed it on her to cause trouble with her mother. She told me that I pretty much have the attitude that people are out to get me. She also had what we call ideas of reference. These are a kind of delusion where you think that something you're seeing that's meant for all of us has some particular meaning for you personally. And the example that I would suggest meets that definition is after she returned to the campus after these homicides, she saw a sign to the effect of, "You are one step closer to your dreams." That's a sign she saw in one of the buildings at college.
And what did she interpret that to mean?
She said, it was just like you just had a stillborn and go home and see a magazine that's full of pictures of babies. That sign was like a fuck you to me. She thought that that sign was directed at her. That now that she had done this, she was one step closer to her dreams. And she saw that as an insult to her and intended as a, quote, fuck you to her, which is another evidence of delusional thinking. The DSM refers to also bizarre delusions. Not all delusions are bizarre. If you think that the FBI is tapping your phone, that's not a bizarre delusion. They're not tapping your phone, but they could be. Her bizarre delusion is, quote, being alive and living are two different things. I don't think I really live, even on the outside. It was like being buried alive. I'm dying or already dead. That's a really bizarre statement, really two statements on her behalf that I see as at time she had this delusion that she wasn't living, that she was already dead.
Does that cover all the delusions before we move on? Because I want to have
Yeah.
ask you some questions.
Well, there's one other thing, and I'm not so sure about this one, but she told me that she got a lot of feedback online about stuff she wrote, and she said at one point that somebody didn't like what she wrote and threatened to kill her, and told her she should be dead, I guess. And
You're just not sure if that really happened.
I'm not sure that it really happened. It could have happened, and if it did happen, then it's not a delusion. But if it didn't happen, I would see it as delusional.
Now, you mentioned that part of the definition of delusion is a fixed belief that can't be shaken.
Yes.
Again, going back to those video evaluations by the state doctor, Dr. Lazaro, did you see evidence that, in fact, Dr. Lazaro is attempting to get her off this delusion that her mother was really going to
Yes,
kill her?
repeatedly she tried.
And what was the result of that?
She couldn't succeed because you're dealing with a delusional person, somebody with schizophrenia. It's not the doctor's fault.
Let me ask you another question. You had mentioned, and you had told us earlier, yesterday in fact, how you go about a mental status exam and
Yes.
kind of the questions that you ask in an attempt to get information. Is it typically your procedure or your way of doing things that if in fact you're evaluating somebody for one of these psychotic disorders and delusions is one of the criteria, you're going to ask the person or the subject about delusions?
Of course. I mean, that goes without saying. That's elementary.
So you're not going to wait for the person to volunteer their delusions. You're going to ask them as the mental health professional and expert, talk to me, have you ever had delusions? Have you ever had hallucinations?
Yeah, well, I might not put it in quite those words. For example, with delusions, I talk about general kinds of delusions. Have you ever felt this? Have you ever felt that? With regard to hallucinations, I generally ask, have you ever had any unusual experiences? No, or yes. Doesn't matter the answer to that. The follow-up from me is then, have you ever heard voices coming from a source you couldn't identify, coming from either inside your head or outside your head? Have you ever seen things that other people couldn't see? Questions along those lines, yes.
I guess my point is you as the mental health professional are going to probe into those areas.
Oh, yeah, and you can't wait for a subject or a patient to volunteer this information. Generally, they won't. If you don't ask, then you don't get a complete evaluation, and your opinion is sunk.
Let's talk about criteria 2 under A, hallucinations. What, if any, evidence did you see as to whether Nicole Nachtman suffered hallucinations?
She told me, and she had told others prior to the homicide, dating back at least to the time she came back from London in 2013, I believe it was, that she heard screaming in her head. Pretty much it sounded like screaming is what she said. She talked about hearing this over time and for at least since she'd been back from England. Her brother said she'd been screaming, she'd had screaming in her head ever since she came back from London. He also said she's been hearing screaming in her head, uncontrollable screaming in her head. It sounds like screaming. It's constantly bothering her. And this is his observation based on the summer that she spent with him in Washington State.
Now, is there a difference between, let's say, an auditory hallucination and a visual hallucination? And does, in fact, the DSM define what those are?
Yes.
Let's go to that for a second.
Okay.
There's actually a glossary of terms in the back, I guess?
Yes.
Page 822, it appears?
Yes, I have it. According to the DSM-5, a hallucination is a perception-like experience with a clarity and impact of a true perception, but without external stimulation of the relevant sensory organ. What that means is that there are different kinds of hallucinations. There are visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, tactile hallucinations, gustatory hallucinations. Sometimes people hallucinate smells, sometimes they hallucinate touch, sometimes they hallucinate visually, and sometimes they hallucinate auditorily. They go on to say, one hallucinating person may recognize a false sensory experience, whereas another may be convinced that the experience is grounded in reality. And then they make it clear that they're not talking about what happens when you're asleep
Or you're dreaming.
Yeah, or when you're falling asleep, the so-called hypnagogic state. That does not refer to, that's not defined as a hallucination.
And what does it specifically say under auditory, under the hallucination definition?
A hallucination involving the perception of sound, mostly of the voice, most commonly of the voice.
Let me ask you this, in addition to, obviously, you said the DSM-5 is a guide in your profession.
Yes.
Are you also aware of any recent articles or literature which kind of define or explain auditory hallucinations, and if you could tell us from what source, if you have that in front of you?
Yes, somewhere. Well, first let me tell you what it is, and then if you want the exact article, I can pull it out.
Or just the source? Is it something
yeah,
that
it's-
people in your field rely on?
Yeah, this is a journal called, I think it's called the Journal of Neuropsychiatry. It's a standard peer-reviewed journal in the field. Recent article looked at hallucinations, auditory hallucinations in particular, and noted that these hallucinations can appear to the individual who's experiencing the hallucinations. They can appear as if they're coming from inside the head or outside the head. And what they opined in this article was that those where it's coming from inside the head, those can sometimes be worse prognostically. In other words, people who have hallucinations that are internal, or that they view them as internal, may have a worse prognosis overall than those whose hallucinations seem to have an external source. But the one thing they made clear is that the general consensus in the field is that auditory hallucinations can be internal or they can be external.
All right,
And they can be perceived either way.
I'm going to go back to the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. Anything else with regard to evidence of hallucinations that Nicole may have been experiencing that you can think of?
Yes. Angelica Henwood talked about how Nicole would spend hours on her computer. And she said that, in her view, Nicole was responding to something, talking to something, but not on the computer. She was speaking out loud, and she, Ms. Henwood, said it made no sense. And Eric indicated that...
Eric Lear?
Yes, Eric Lear, yeah. That she had been talking to herself ever since she started college. What we call that is responding to internal stimuli, and that's part of a good mental status examination to determine whether the individual is responding to external or internal stimuli, i.e. hallucinations. Many times people won't acknowledge that. But you'll see it because you'll see them talking to themselves, or you'll see them responding to someone who apparently isn't there. And that's what I see Ms. Henwood testifying to, and Eric Lear, his version supports that as well.
And was Eric Lear one of the instances I think he described in his testimony with regard to the restaurant, and she's literally sitting there talking to somebody who wasn't next to her?
Yes, exactly. And she's, again, what we would say in our field is she is responding to internal stimuli. Whatever it is, it's not somebody talking to her. She's talking to a voice or responding to something that she's experiencing internally. That is a delusion. I'm sorry, that's a hallucination, not delusion.
What about disorganized speech? Any evidence of that with Nicole?
Yes. Throughout my examination of her, throughout Dr. Lazarou's examination of her, and as reported in the testimony and report by Dr. Heidi, her thinking is often very disorganized. She goes off on tangents, she's rambling, she's circumstantial, she's derailed in her thinking. Dr. Lazarou commented upon it numerous times in her evaluation of Nicole, that she wasn't making sense, that she was making the doctor feel crazy, that she was constantly going off on tangents. Those are all evidence of disorganized behavior as reflected in speech. The other thing is that there's something that we call loose associations that is almost exclusively seen in psychosis, like schizophrenia. She would come to a point where she'd be talking about one thing, and then that would trigger another thing, and she'd be off on that. That would trigger another thing, and she'd be off on that. And minutes later, even I'd forgotten what the question was that I asked, because her thought became so derailed. And she would loosely associate.
Let me ask you a question, and I know we're going to talk about the police interview later when we talk about insanity and your opinion as it relates to that, but did you see evidence of this concept that you're describing now just in the midst of she's being questioned by homicide detectives and she's rambling on about the Snow Queen and this fictional story?
Well, certainly during the 10 hours that she was in police custody, the videotapes that I reviewed, her behavior reflects affect that's grossly inappropriate to the situation. She has just killed her stepfather and her mother. She's just been arrested by the police, and she's talking about fantasy. She's talking about the movie,
Frozen?
Frozen, yes. I know it very well because my granddaughter was a big Frozen fan when she was 5 years old. She was talking away and laughing and having a grand old time with the police, and it was just totally inappropriate. I definitely would say that that is inappropriate behavior, and it is grossly disorganized behavior. I've never seen anything quite that inappropriate in all the years that I've been doing this.
Any other evidence just in accounts from former roommates or friends that, or not really friends, the one friend, Laura, in college, any information to suggest there were other examples of this, I guess we're now at 4, did we
Yes.
leave 3? Okay, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, she was found sleeping in the bathroom on the floor. She was found sleeping in the hallway on the floor. She would sleep all day, stay up all night. She dressed inappropriately for the weather conditions. As I mentioned, she didn't wash her clothing. She didn't brush her teeth. She didn't comb her hair. She had a discernible body odor. All those are signs of grossly disorganized behavior.
Now I want to go to, I guess, negative symptoms,
Yes.
Which is 5.
Yeah, negative symptoms are, they're called negative because you're not going to see them as a clinician. You're not going to see the person talking about delusions. You're not going to see the person admitting to hallucinations. Negative symptoms, well, the first that I observed was what we call avolition, A-V-O-L-I-T-I-O-N. It's a severe lack of initiative to accomplish tasks in your life. She stopped attending classes. She stopped attending to her hygiene. She let her personal appearance go. As I said, she didn't shower. She didn't brush her teeth. She didn't comb her hair. She stayed in her room. She stopped eating properly. She lost interest in engaging with other people other than on the computer. And it's not entirely clear that she even engaged with people on the computer. She spoke rarely to anybody. She retreated into a fantasy world. What she said to me was, if life becomes more miserable and demeaning, I'll go back into my fantasy. She slept through her classes, slept all day, didn't clean her room. She also described, as I mentioned, this message, and I don't know if it was just her interpretation of it. I don't know if I would call that a negative symptom, but somebody had told her to die, to kill herself. And when she described this to me, she was laughing inappropriately. She had pretty much lost communication and touch with other people. I asked her why she didn't communicate with others. She said, most conversations are related to the past. My past is negative, so I don't have that much to talk about. Her brother, Joey, talked about the summer she spent with him, that he had to virtually drag her out of the bedroom to get her to come out. He said that her room stunk and that he would have to tell her and remind her repeatedly to take a shower. In terms of avolition, she said, I felt emotionally hopeless, like life itself, like a dead end. I had no motivation, no inspiration. I was going nowhere. No goal, no vision, no dreams. It's like I was drifting out to sea. I was technically not living at all. And then she described this fantasy life in college. She said, classes are every other day, so you have empty space for your brain to rest and procrastinate and take a break and go into my fantasy world. A lot of times I didn't want to come back to reality. I'd stop my thought processes, and when I returned, I'd have to ask myself where I was heading to. You can't just bookmark where you are. I was more consumed by fantasy. There were more windows to slip out of, and I had a hard time slipping back in. During college, my fantasies blurred with reality. There was nothing to focus on. I was just here without a compass, map, or direction. Fantasy was something I was familiar with. It had a plot that's going somewhere to a degree. I acted out fantasy. A lot of the characters are inspiring. I try to take their personalities with me.
Now, when you move into that same area of the DSM where it talks about associated features that support a diagnosis of schizophrenia, I believe you talked about that inappropriate affect in the first line, which you described the laughing at inappropriate times and things like that.
Yes.
Is there anything else within this section that supports a diagnosis of schizophrenia for Nicole?
Well, clearly the disturbed sleep pattern that hits it right on the head. Daytime sleeping and nighttime activity. Also includes deficits in the ability to infer the intentions of other people. This is where the delusions come in, I believe. She was unable to discern how other people were going to react to her. She assumed the negative. And this came up repeatedly with Dr. Lazaro. She hit on it repeatedly. That Nicole Nachtman sees the world not in black and white, but in black, very negatively. That she believes that the intentions of other people are to take advantage of her, to get her, and in the case of her mother, to kill her. The last thing that's noted there is individuals with psychosis may lack insight or awareness of their disorder. This really jumped out at me with Nicole Nachtman. She doesn't understand that she's mentally ill. She did her best to convince me that she wasn't mentally ill. She thinks that these are just problems in daily living, that she just doesn't like to associate with people. She prefers to be on a computer, to be in a fantasy world. She doesn't see anything wrong with that. That's what we call lack of insight. She has no insight into her disorder. And to that I would add, and it's mentioned in the DSM as well, that a lack of insight is one of the characteristics that bodes poorly. It's a poor prognostic factor. If you don't know that you're mentally ill, or you won't accept the fact that you're mentally ill, you're unlikely to accept treatment. And that's what we're seeing with her in the jail. She doesn't want to be treated because she doesn't feel that she has any mental illness.
Let me go back to the time frame that was discussed in A. Can you explain the time, I guess, requirements with regard to the time period before you can give a diagnosis of schizophrenia?
Yes.
And when you believe the onset began with Nicole, and whether it meets that requirement of the time frame?
Well, some of the witness accounts occurred before she went to London. But I would say for sure these symptoms emerged after she came back from London.
Which would have been in 2013.
Yes. But some of the symptoms were present before then.
Now, within this part of the DSM, I want to show you a graphic that we used yesterday. You can kind of just explain what this shows with regard to schizophrenia, spectrum, and other psychotic disorders.
Yes. This
Start with schizotypal.
There's a diagnosis called schizotypal personality disorder. That's at the low end of the schizophrenia spectrum.
But we're on the same spectrum.
Yeah,
Okay.
it goes from there all the way to schizophrenia. Part of the distinction, you have schizotypal at one end, then brief psychotic disorder, schizophreniform disorder, and schizophrenia. Some of these can be distinguished based on how long the symptoms lasted. Whether it was 1 day to less than a month, that would be a brief psychotic disorder. Whether it was 1 month to less than 6 months, schizophreniform disorder, or if it lasted 6 months or longer, it would be schizophrenia. This line on the left is drawn to distinguish schizotypal personality disorder. The main difference between being schizotypal and being schizophrenic is that schizophrenia requires evidence of hallucinations and delusions. Schizotypal personality disorder does not. It's a much less serious end of the scale, but it's still on the scale of schizophreniform or schizophrenia disorders.
Thank you, Doctor.
Could I?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The only thing I can add to that is, and this is from the DSM-5 as well, that not all people who have schizophrenia previously suffered from schizotypal.
Okay.
And not all people who suffer from schizotypal ultimately develop schizophrenia. I believe, based on the criteria for schizotypal personality, that what we were seeing with Nicole Nachtman when she was younger was schizotypal personality. It fits it like a glove. But once she starts having hallucinations and delusions, that puts her from
Out of
that
that
end
category
into schizophrenia, yes.
Can you explain what malingering is to the jury?
Yes, it's a conscious effort to create in another person the belief that you suffer from an illness, including mental illness. And it's usually for what we call secondary gain. It's to gain something. It's not uncommon for people in the forensic evaluations I do to see them exaggerate symptoms or make up symptoms. That's malingering.
What is your opinion as to whether you saw evidence that Nicole was feigning or exaggerating or making up any of these symptoms that she was reporting both to you, Dr. Lazaro, and all the records you reviewed?
Quite to the contrary. As I said, she wants us to believe she's not mentally ill. She sees that as a stigma, and she relates honestly and openly about her feelings and her behaviors, but she doesn't see them as mentally ill at all. So to me, that's the direct opposite of someone who is malingering. She's not malingering.
Now, are there tests that mental health professionals in your field can administer to determine if, in fact, an individual is malingering or not?
No. There are checklists that purport to help people make that decision. My view of them is that they may be helpful in some cases, but they're not tests. There's no acid test. Even a polygraph is not an acid test as to whether somebody's malingering a mental illness.
Just to first ask you, did you administer any of these checklists or instruments with Nicole?
No.
Were you, however, given results? Well, first you indicated you reviewed Dr. Heidi's report, correct?
Yes, I did.
And in Dr. Heidi's 52-page report, she documented several of these instruments that she administered to Nicole and gave the scores and kind of the validity scores, and she talked
Yes.
about all that yesterday.
Yes, and the thing to keep in mind about that is those validity scores, they help establish that Nicole is being truthful about her answers to the questions on that particular test. It doesn't rule out malingering. It doesn't rule in malingering. It doesn't rule out truth-telling or lying in other areas. It says when she took this test, she was telling the truth.
And so you had that data available to you with regard to what the scores were?
Yes, I looked
prior.
at it. Yes.
In addition to Dr. Heidi's, the tests or the instruments that she administered to Nicole, were you also provided the SIMS from the state doctor, Dr. Lazaro,
Yeah.
and that?
Yeah,
Dr.
Dr. Lazaro kindly forwarded that to me and
Okay.
so I could review it.
And is that common that those types of things can be shared among doctors and experts, just
Yeah.
not with us?
Yes.
Okay.
And the reason is because we want to maintain the security of the checklist or the test if it is a test, so that people in the future don't know the questions that are going to be asked.
And what was that, and we'll call it the SIMS, what was that, what is the purpose of that, or what is?
It's, well, let me pull it out. The SIMS is, it actually stands for Structured Inventory of Malingered Symptomatology, and it's trademarked. It's, so that's part of the reason why it can't be generally distributed. But basically, the idea that these two psychologists who developed this had was that there are certain questions you can ask, and this is filled out completely by the patient. And their idea was that there are certain things that could be asked, and if you chalked up enough of them, then it might be evidence that you are malingering.
And you used the word might. Why did you use that word?
Well, because even they acknowledge that there's no clear test for malingering. This is just a guide. It may be helpful. and I agree with that. I don't think that there is any test for malingering. And they don't purport this to be a test. It's a structured inventory, they call it.
Did you also have an opportunity to review the manual associated with this SIMS test that Dr. Lazaro, or instrument, she administered to Nicole?
Yes.
And what specifically does the manual require the person administering it to do?
To read the instructions verbatim to the individual who's filling out the questions.
Let me stop you there. You had an opportunity to review the state doctor's evaluation, the videotape, correct?
Yes.
And in that video evaluation, was Dr. Lazaro actually administering this SIMS to Nicole?
She gave it to her, yes.
Did she follow that specific requirement that the manual indicates to repeat the instructions or read the instructions verbatim?
No.
Is there also something else within the manual that indicates you should use other sources when determining an opinion on malingering or opining on malingering?
Yeah, it says, and this is from the authors of this checklist, the SIMS is not intended to serve as a diagnostic tool for feigning in isolation. Individuals identified as potential malingerers through the use of the SIMS should be referred for more extensive assessment. A determination of feigning should be made in the context of comprehensive evaluation only, whereby multiple sources of data, for example, psychosocial, psychiatric, and medical history, clinical interview, comparison of subjective reports of symptoms to objective information and observations, results from feigning specific and psychological inventories, as well as multiple assessment devices. So they make it clear that not only would you need more data from various sources, but you need to have multiple assessment devices. In other words, other psychological testing before you could say someone was malingering based on the score that he or she attained on this inventory.
When Dr. Lazaro provided you the actual test or instrument that she administered to Nicole, did she, along with it, were you able to view the scores and how, in the various areas that the instrument was measuring?
Yes.
And in fact, did that measure or that instrument indicate that Nicole was in any way malingering, feigning, or exaggerating symptoms when it came to psychosis?
No. In fact, her score is 0 for malingering with regard to psychosis. And schizophrenia is psychosis.
Dr. Ewing, I want to go now to Nicole's discussion with you about the killings.
Okay.
Obviously, your ultimate opinion is you believe Nicole was insane at the time of the offenses, and we'll go through the jury instruction in a minute. But can you kind of just describe for the jury Nicole's account of the killings and what evidence of schizophrenia, severe mental illness, psychosis, delusional thinking you observed in her account with respect to the killings of Bob and Miriam?
Well, first of all, it's obvious to me that she was suffering from a severe mental illness at the time. She was suffering from schizophrenia, which it's no exaggeration, I think, to say that schizophrenia is the cancer of mental illness. It's the most severe mental illness. We discussed what led up to it, and it's clear to me that she was delusional and that she believed that her mother would kill her when she revealed all of these lies and half-truths and evasions that she had used with her mother. Things lying about her bicycle not being stolen, lying about renting a shed to store her belongings, lying about the dormitory, that she had gotten a room, that she didn't forget to get the room. There are a whole bunch of really small things that piled up for her. Things that for a normal person I wouldn't see as all that awful. And I certainly wouldn't see them as your mother's going to kill you, literally kill you, when you tell her these things. She also seemed to feel delusionally that her mother had some kind of omnipotence, that her mother could get things out of her that she didn't want her to give to her mother, that her mother could question her and make her somehow talk, which I see as delusional, because I don't see how her mother could do that. And I noticed that in Dr. Heidi's testimony, she talked about how even after, long after these killings and long after she'd been charged with these killings, she was talking about how her mother would help determine what the criminal justice system did with her. So she was delusional, and a lot of the delusions focused on her mother.
Let's back up a little bit, because as we now know, Bob was killed first.
Yes.
Can you talk about what Nicole's mindset was? Was she suicidal? What's going on before the killing of Bob?
What she indicated to me, and it makes sense to me, is that she was suicidal. She was planning to kill herself. She had worked up what she thought was the nerve to kill herself. And when I asked her why she killed Bob, her stepfather, she said, "I don't know what my thought process was. An overwhelming fear. It was like a flash forward. It felt like the confrontation with my mother was taking place. It was like that fast forwarded through my head like a movie. I thought, I'm going to die. Mom's going to kill me, and they're going to cover it up. I can't explain killing Bob. Fear does not have a rationality. Even though nothing was happening, I felt like I was suffocating. It was very hard to live. I had dug my own grave with lies. It was more like a panic. I shot Bob in the head. I was planning to shoot myself. He was there. I shot him in the back of the head, one shot. I panicked, and I thought someone would hear and call the cops and come and arrest me."
I want to put up the insanity jury instruction. Doctor, are you familiar with this?
Yes.
And this is likely going to be the instruction that the judge gives the jury in this case. First of all, when we're talking about insanity, are we talking about now, 4 years later, or are we talking about August of 2015 when these offenses occurred?
We're talking about at the time of the offenses.
So let's go through the prongs, and in fact, the first sentence says, if you can read that.
Yes, I can. You want me to read it?
Yes.
An issue in this case is whether Nicole Nachtman was insane when the crime allegedly was committed. So that's time of offense.
Okay.
A person is considered to be insane when, one, she has a mental infirmity, disease, or defect. She obviously is mentally ill, and she suffers from schizophrenia, which is a lifelong, treatable, but incurable illness. Because of this condition, A, she did not know what she was doing or its consequences. Or B, although she knew what she was doing and its consequences, she did not know it was wrong.
Is your opinion in this case as to whether Nicole Nachtman was insane at the time of the offenses, and I'm going to ask you about each offense,
Okay.
apply, or are you basing that on prong A?
I believe she had a mental disease or defect, and because of that mental disease or defect, she didn't know what she was doing, and she didn't know the consequences of what she was doing. With regard to B, which only comes into question if A is not met, I don't have an opinion on that. There is evidence in the record to suggest that she did know that it was wrong at or around the time of these killings. Legally wrong.
Meaning she knew it was wrong to kill somebody.
Yes.
You believe there's evidence to suggest that?
Yes,
But you don't need to go, or the jury instruction does not require a finding of A and B because there's an or there separating the two. Is that your understanding?
that's correct.
And your opinion as to whether Nicole was insane at the time of the offenses, you're using prong A?
Yes, both portions. She did not know what she was doing, and she did not know its consequences. But
Now, let's break them up into Bob. Is that your opinion as it relates to the killing of Robert Deans?
yes,
And is that based on what you just testified to as far as the mental infirmity, disease, or defect, but more importantly, what you just relayed to us as far as her report to you about what happened when she killed Bob or what her thought process was?
it's both. My opinion is that she was ready to commit suicide. She told me that there was a phone call that she overheard between her stepfather and her mother in which they were discussing financial difficulties. And this for Nicole, somehow she interpreted this as a knock on her, that it was, she was the cause. Her mother was spending money to send her to college, her mother was giving her money for a car, giving her money to live on. She took that as a negative for her. That just added one more log to the suicidal fire that was already burning, so to speak. She told me that killing Bob pretty much guaranteed that her mother would kill her. And I asked her, and I believe that Dr. Lazaro asked her too, well, if you thought your mother was going to kill you, but you're going to kill yourself, why is that such a bad thing? You'll get your wish. If you're suicidal and somebody comes along and says, I'll kill you, why does that bother you? She went on to explain further that she was ambivalent, that, and she said this probably even more directly to the state's doctor, Dr. Lazaro, but she said it to me as well, that she had a hard time killing herself. That, and she explained to Dr. Lazaro that, and this is true in my experience, I've dealt with a lot of suicidal patients over the course of my career. It's not easy to kill yourself. Many people don't succeed in killing themselves because it's so difficult, even though they want to kill themselves. She was ambivalent at best. She said that, and this is coming from her explanation to Dr. Lazaro, that the will to live basically kicks in. She said it's like when you're drowning, you may want to die, but your body kicks in and won't let it happen.
These are Nicole's words.
These
correct?
are basic, paraphrase,
Yes, go ahead.
not a direct quote. But my interpretation of what she was saying, both to Dr. Lazaro and to me, was I want to kill myself, I don't want to kill myself. I want to die, I want to live. Marked ambivalence is one of the hallmarks of schizophrenia. And she's suicidal, but she can't do it. And killing Bob, her stepfather, pretty much ensured in her mind that her mother would kill her.
What is your opinion as to whether Nicole Nachtman was insane, again, using the same criteria we've talked about, prong 1 and then prong 2A, as it relates to the killing of her mother, Miriam Deans?
Again, she has a mental infirmity, disease, or defect. As a result of that, she didn't know what she was doing or its consequences. Both. And again, I would have to say that there is evidence, subsequent evidence, that is evidence of behavior that occurred after the killings that I believe could be read as suggesting that she knew it was legally wrong to kill her parents.
Which that would be prong B, and you're opining insanity under prong A.
Yes.
Can you explain explain to the jury the difference between or among patients who suffer from schizophrenia, people who may, as we're sitting today in court, responding to external stimuli, looking around, or fidgety, versus someone who may have schizophrenia but isn't exhibiting all those symptoms 24 hours a day?
Well, people who have schizophrenia, it's a very severe mental illness. It's the most severe. But they're college professors. I have a colleague, not where I work, but who's a law professor. She's schizophrenic. She's written a book about how she tried and struggled and overcame a lot of the symptoms of the disorder to go on to become a law professor. Now that's a rare case, I would agree. But in my practice, I see many people who are schizophrenic, who have jobs, who have a relatively normal life, but from time to time the symptoms overwhelm them. And it can be in a very short period of time that the symptoms increase or decrease. And there are times when I've seen people, and as a professional, as a forensic psychologist, who I know they're schizophrenic because the history is clear, and yet in talking to them, I don't see at that time specific symptoms of schizophrenia. So it's not a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365-day a year, and 366 in leap year kind of proposition. It doesn't manifest itself all the time. And some of the symptoms that are manifested, we can't see. Like, I'm looking at Ms. Nachtman right now. I can't tell what she's thinking. She may be hallucinating right now. She may be delusional. I don't know that.
With regard to the records you reviewed, and you've already indicated the basis of your opinion for schizophrenia and insanity, but did you observe within the records this mental health deterioration over time occurring in Nicole Nachtman's life? And was there, in
Yes.
fact, corroborative data or evidence to suggest that that was happening?
Yes. I mentioned it yesterday, the third grade, the psychological evaluation that was done on her, clear warning signs that this child was having significant emotional, psychological problems. And then again, when she was either 7th and 8th or 8th and 9th grade at the Air Academy, her behavior was clearly troubled. She was clearly a troubled child, and the school required her to have a psychiatric evaluation. I didn't see that evaluation, but I did see that there was no follow-up, no treatment ever for Nicole.
There's been a discussion throughout the trial that she got into FSU. She was obviously intelligent. She had a good enough GPA. Can you explain mental illness and intelligence?
Yeah.
I think you said your colleague, the law professor.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
right, and a graduate of Yale Law School. And many people who have severe mental disorders are very bright. I would say, based on my interactions with Nicole, that she is at least average intelligence, and she may be somewhat above average intelligence. She clearly had the intelligence to get into college. She clearly had the intelligence to do better academically than she did. And what we saw is in the years leading up to the killing, her grades went down and down and down and down. And she was in a downward spiral academically. That wasn't because she was incapable of doing the work intellectually. It was because she was incapable of doing the work because of her mental illness. So there's a huge difference between intelligence and mental illness.
Dr. Ewing, yesterday I believe we discussed, in talking about Nicole's childhood and her history, the number of schools she had went to. And I think you had mentioned yesterday you weren't sure if it was somewhere between 9 and 12.
Yes.
If I show you a list, will that refresh your recollection as to how many schools she went to and kind of document not only schools, but the state she was in?
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. 13 different schools in Florida and Virginia.
And those seem to be the states she was moving back and forth from.
Yeah, I went Tampa, Virginia, Tampa, Virginia, Virginia, Tampa, Virginia, Virginia, Tampa, Virginia, Melbourne, Florida, Virginia, back to Tampa.
Thank you, Dr. I want to elaborate a little bit within the insanity instruction and within with regard to your opinion on the consequences portion of this. Where in the jail visit with her brother, the police interview, all of the documents you reviewed to support that opinion that in fact she didn't appreciate or understand the consequences of what she had done or even what was about to happen?
Well, I believe that she didn't appreciate the consequences of what she was doing at the time she committed these acts. But it went beyond that. As Dr. Heidi pointed out, she continued not to really understand what she did. She continued to talk about her mother in the first person, or as if she was alive, her stepfather, as if he were still alive, using the present tense. She talked about, with Dr. Heidi, about how her mother had some control over what would happen in these criminal proceedings against her. And she, when asked about what the legal consequences would be for her, she seemed to think that she could be banished from the state, put on some kind of probation, fined, made to do community service type work. She had no clue. Even then, this is well after the killing. She's still without a clue as to what the legal consequences are. But I want to make sure that I'm being clear here, because I'm saying she didn't understand the consequences at the time of the homicide. That's what the statute requires us to look at.
Yes, sir. With regard to, again, you mentioned, even after the instances, with regard to the jail visitation or even the police interrogation that's within a day or so, what about those two did you see evidence that she's just not grasping what has just occurred?
Well, as I said earlier, here's somebody who has just killed her stepfather, shot him to death, shot to death her mother, and is taken into custody by the police, and she's acting as if life is just another ordinary day. She's chatting with the police officers, telling them about Frozen, telling them about the fantasy stuff she does online, laughing, giggling, totally inappropriate. And then the video, I take it you're talking about the video with her brother.
Yes, which I believe was within maybe a week of her arrest.
Yeah, and she's happy as a lark. Her affect and attitude are totally inappropriate. And to me, they reflect that she doesn't get it. She doesn't understand what she's done and what the legal consequences are likely to be for her. In fact, I believe she talked about Christmas.
She's buying Christmas presents for his children.
Right. She's making plans to celebrate Christmas with him and his children, which is obviously far-fetched. I would say delusional.
Thank you, Doctor. If I can have a moment?
Absolutely.
I don't have any other questions. Thank you, Dr. Ewing.
Does anybody in the jury need a break at this time before we begin the cross? Break? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a short break before we do the cross-examination. Please do not discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. Please do not do any research related to the case, and please avoid any exposure to the case outside of the courtroom. All rise for the jury.